Okay. All right. Well, I can see most people have joined now, so we're going to officially start the webinar. So hello everyone and welcome to the HE Public Sector Update Is Your Accessibility Statement Ready Yet webinar. My name's Annie Mannion. I'm Digital Communications Manager at AbilityNet and I'll be running you through what you can expect from the session. Just to go through a few bits of housekeeping before we start the content for today's session. Live captions are on the webinar from MyClearText. So thank you to Claire from MyClearText for that. You can turn them on using the CC option in the control panel. And additional captions are available on streamtext.net. And you can also see them on slideshare.net/AbilityNet. If you have any technical issues and you need to leave early, don't worry, you'll receive an email with the recording, transcript and slides. And also, I can see most of you have been able to use the Q&A window. So if you have any queries or comments for us to address, or you want to ask the presenters any questions, do drop those in the Q&A area as well. And then we do have a feedback form at the end, which invites you to tell us about any future topics that you'd like us to cover in our webinars. So do let us know if you have anything to share. So I'm joined today by Alistair McNaught of McNaught Consulting, George Rhodes, who's Accessibility Consultant at All Able, Nick Jarvis-Smith from the Department for Education, and James Baverstock from AbilityNet. For those of you who aren't familiar with AbilityNet, we support people of any age living with any disability or impairment to use technology to achieve their goals at home, at work and in education. We do this by providing specialist advice, free services, information resources, and I'll share a little more about our services at the end of the webinar as well. So a quick overview of what we'll be covering. So with 2 months to go until the public sector body's accessibility regulations deadline, James Baverstock, who is a senior accessibility consultant at AbilityNet, will provide an update of the basics of what your statement needs to contain. Alistair McNaught of McNaught Consultancy, he's notched up 16 years in the sector as a digital inclusion advocate. You might recognise him from our HE update webinars that we've been running over the past year. He'll be sharing information about statements specifically on virtual learning environments, course content and library resources. And then George Rhodes of All Able joins us to share his recent research into accessibility statements, and he'll share some good examples with you. And Nick Jarvis-Smith has been working with George on his research and will outline some of the findings that they've discovered for essential services. And then we'll have a Q&A at the end. Can I just check if you need to raise your hand in the Q&A panel, or if you've got any comments to make in the Q&A panel, my colleague Mark will be helping to answer any queries. Okay, so we'll now just move on to the poll. Let me just launch that. So with 2 months to go until the deadline, how confident are you that your accessibility statement is compliant? So answer 1 is very confident, answer 2 is quite confident, answer 3 is not too confident, and answer 4 is concerned. Again, depending on how you've joined the webinar, you may need to respond in the Q&A panel rather than using the poll. So we've got 66% of you have voted so far, so I'll just leave it a few more seconds. Okay, I'm going to end the poll now. And as you can see, we've got 5% are very confident, so that's great for 5% of you. 36% are quite confident. The majority of you, 47%, are not too confident, and then 12% are concerned. So hopefully at the end of this webinar, you'll have some useful pointers and tips to take away. Okay. So I'm going to hand over to our first presenter now, who is James Baverstock from AbilityNet. Over to you, James.
Thanks, Annie. So today I'm going to be running through the basics of what you need to know about accessibility statements. Can we go to the next slide? So why are we specifically talking about accessibility statements today? Providing an accessibility statement is a requirement of the snappily titled Public Sector Bodies, Websites and Mobile Applications Accessibility Regulations 2018 that can be thankfully abbreviated as PSBAR, or you may also hear it referred to as the regulations or the accessibility regulations. And this originated in an EU directive, but it's now part of UK law. And as we've mentioned, there's a deadline coming up for this of 23rd September 2020, when all public sector websites need a statement to comply. Any websites published since September 2018 needed a statement by September 2019, but 23rd September this year is the deadline for older websites. So it's the point when all of your public websites need a statement. Now, a very common question that comes up recently is whether the deadlines are going to be extended because of COVID-19, but it's been made clear that this is not going to happen, that the deadlines are not going to be extended. So Richard Morton, who's the head of accessibility at the Government Digital Service, or GDS, who are responsible for monitoring accessibility statements, said last month that there are no current plans to change the compliance dates. Although he said GDS do understand there are added pressures on public sector teams at this time. I think it's worth considering here, though, that you could say that the need for digital services to be accessible has never been greater than at the current time, and the pandemic has really highlighted the importance of online services being available for everybody, and therefore heightened the importance of these regulations and what they're trying to achieve. Next slide. So, in terms of the requirements for accessibility statements, the idea is that organisations need to provide a detailed, comprehensive and clear accessibility statement on the compliance of their websites and mobile applications. So saying detailed and comprehensive here is important because historically accessibility statements on websites have not been particularly detailed or comprehensive, and you often see short statements with general aspirations towards accessibility that have been put up years ago and never updated. But the idea now is that the accessibility statements for the regulations will be more detailed and be regularly reviewed and updated so they accurately represent the current state of sites, and they'll ideally be aligned to your development roadmap, so they'll be updated as your website changes. You also need to make sure that they're published in an accessible format, such as HTML, in an easy to find location on the relevant website, which by convention is going to be the footer for websites. With apps, it may be embedded within the app or included in the App Store listing. And accessibility statements also need to include particular required content. So if we can move to the next slide. So there's certain things that must be in your statement, and these include the name of the public sector body and the website or app that the statement applies to. You need to include a compliance statement, so you need to say whether you're fully compliant, partially compliant, or not compliant. And in terms of websites, this is compliance with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG 2.1 level AA. But it should be emphasized that the expectation is that many sites, particularly more complex sites, will be partially rather than fully compliant, at least initially, as full WCAG 2.1 AA compliance is difficult to achieve when you have large sites that change a lot, because even having a single issue on one page could potentially mean non-conformance. You also need to include details of any non-accessible content, including why it's not accessible and indicating accessible alternatives. And you also need to explain any claims you make for disproportionate burden. So disproportionate burden is where the impact of fully meeting the requirements is too much for an organisation to reasonably cope with. But to claim this, you need to have carried out an assessment weighing up the burden that making particular things accessible places on your organisation as against the benefits of making those things accessible for people with disabilities. You also need to include when the statement was prepared and updated. And you also need to include details of a feedback mechanism and contact information. So this is very important. You need to ensure that there's a way to contact you, and you need to consider how accessibility queries are going to be dealt with within your organisation when they come in via that contact. And finally, you also need to include details of the enforcement procedure. So this is how someone can raise to an external body that you haven't addressed issues that they've highlighted to you. So if we move to the next slide. So on gov.uk, you can view a sample accessibility statement that the government's provided. And there's a link available here that you can reference for that. This is a sample accessibility statement to help you write a statement for your own website or app. And some of the wording in this is legally required, so you need to make sure you include that in your statement. The wording of the sample statement was updated in April. So if you prepared your statement before April, it's worth reviewing the revised wording when you next review your statement and make sure that it's aligned. Having a sample accessibility statement was a requirement of the original EU directive that said that governments were required to each create a sample statement. But the UK government also did user research about what users wanted out of accessibility statements and how they could be most helpful. And you'll see in the sample statement, as well as the compulsory areas mentioned, it also suggests you include information about what accessibility features are supported on your site. It also includes a link to our AbilityNet My Computer My Way service with advice for making your device easier to use if you have a disability. And they also suggest linking to an accessibility roadmap so people can see your plans and timescales for fixing things. So next slide. So in thinking about the purpose of these accessibility statements, at base, they're there to help enforcement of the regulations, helping users report issues to the enforcement body and with technical compliance reporting. So they provide what enforcement needs, as shown on the slide. But we can also think of them as a positive way of providing what users want to help users with disabilities access websites and gain the alternative formats they need. By helping users to understand what parts of the site they may struggle with, there's the potential here to help users who may not realise they have an access issue until they are partway through a process. So you're preventing the frustration of someone spending a long time filling in a form that they can't finish, or a student spending ages to find a particular report which they find isn't accessible once they get to it. And critically, a statement should also help users report issues to you. This gives you the opportunity to provide tailored assistance and is also great in terms of giving you valuable feedback on your accessibility efforts, so you can remove barriers as they're reported. We often say that this type of feedback should be considered like getting free user testing from people with disabilities, and it's important to have a process in place so you can effectively respond to it and benefit from it. So if we think of accessibility statements ambitiously and positively, beyond just box ticking or minimal compliance, this is a great opportunity to really help your users. And next slide. So in the specific context of higher education, this is a really nice opportunity to engage with students who may need additional support. As well as informing people about barriers, you can use it as a means to signpost support that's available in your organisation, such as how to access alternative formats. You can use statements to explain built-in tools and options that are available, including things like any assistive technology available on your network. You can use it to help students develop technology strategies and the best way to access things, help manage expectations and avoid frustration by warning people up front about problems with particular resources, and you can facilitate early requests for alternative formats and reasonable adjustments. So that's a quick overview of the basics of the regulations, and now I'll hand over to Alistair who is going to talk more about how accessibility statements can be used in the context of higher education.
Thank you very much, James. And this applies also to further education as well as higher education. And so next slide, please, Annie. A lot of organizations are understandably focusing on their external website because that's the thing that's most public for most people. But it's really important that we look beyond the website, because if you consider the student experience, the student looks at the website a few times in their life, but their daily experience looking at the virtual learning environment, looking at course content, going to the library for ebooks and journals, that daily experience is actually much more pertinent to their sense of achievement, their sense of frustration as they work through your digital resources. So next slide. I think it's important to be able to put some context around accessibility statements. And so one of the things that I've been thinking about is how we might look at a maturity model for accessibility statements in exactly the same way that AbilityNet and myself have worked on an accessibility maturity model for education. And just as the educational accessibility maturity model goes from sort of luck to tokenism, to standards, to ownership, to partnership, and that whole focus on standards isn't the full end of maturity, it's just somewhere in the middle. In a similar kind of way, if we look at the next slide, I think we can consider your accessibility statements following the same sort of pattern. So the luck stage would be, with luck, nobody would notice that we didn't write one. That is a non-intelligent response and a non-intelligent maturity level. The second stage, which I've seen a lot, surprisingly, a scary amount, is the tokenism level, where somebody's done a basic check and they've literally copied and pasted the GDS example. And I look at it and I think, but that's word for word the sample statement. So that's almost certainly non-compliant. And then the third stage is the standard stage, where somebody adapts the GDS example and they substitute their own findings. Great, that's what people do, that's what you're encouraged to do. But you're only compliant at that point. Compliance and customer service are quite different things. So the next stage would be ownership, where you're working to support platform owners in embedding long-term improvements and actually changing their skills, changing their culture. That shows a sort of committed stage of maturity, and it definitely takes you further than simply being compliant. And then the last stage, which ties into what James was talking about just now, what people want to know, how people can exploit the benefits that you've given them through your accessibility practices. That final stage of partnership is having the user experience at the center, helping every one of your users not just to know that you're accessible, but to know what that means in terms of what they can then do with your content. And that's the bit where it becomes transformative and you move from compliance to culture change. So next slide. Here's just a couple of critiques of compliance. So this is just to show, these are from two real sample accessibility statements. I mean, not even samples, so real live accessibility statements. The first example, you should be able to navigate most of the website using a keyboard. Okay, well, that's compliant. And I can prove it's compliant because it's actually taken from the GDS sample. But navigating to most of the website, aren't you going to tell me which parts of the website I can't navigate to? Otherwise, what have I gained? I still have to work my way through, try things, find that they don't work, and then go and tell you that I need an alternative format. So that's compliant, but not helpful. The second example, some of our online forms are difficult to navigate just using a keyboard and screen reader software. Okay, well, it would have been really nice if I'd known in advance which of those online forms, because if that's an online form about getting disability support or getting accommodation, and I know that I want to get accommodation, then I need to know that there's no point in me even trying to use that form at the moment. I need to contact someone separately. So, and that particular example was from the EHRC. So totally compliant, but not helpful. So let's look at the next slide. A better example, and this also is from the EHRC, so I'm being completely fair, I'm not being biased in any way. This is a really nice example where they've talked about their infographics and they've said which ones are actually difficult to navigate. That's much more helpful. Next slide, please. When we take these considerations together, there's a sense in which we can move from the accessibility statement being a compliant static document to it being a document that takes us further. And for this, I've been working on what I call the facts model. So is your accessibility statement formative? It tells people how to exploit the accessibility features. Is it actionable? So when you say that something doesn't work, there's a clarity about what they then do and where they'll find those bits and what the alternatives are. Obviously, is it compliant? That's important, but that doesn't take you far, as we've seen. Is it transparent in terms of the auditing, the remediation that you've put in place, the disproportionate burden arguments, which George, I'm sure, will touch on later? And then, is it supportive in terms of, yes, you have to have contact details, that's compliance, but if your contact details include not just a single email, but maybe include a different email depending on what the nature of your issue is, or maybe include a phone if you're somebody that has struggles with writing emails or vice versa. That sort of support, giving information about the response time. Can I expect things in 48 hours, in 3 weeks, in 5 weeks? That sort of information, and particularly, and I've done this with a couple of organizations I've worked with recently, making sure that threaded throughout the statement is linked to, okay, this is a problem, these PDFs might be a problem, but here's how you might be able to help yourself in the meantime. But if that doesn't work for you, here's how to contact us. So being really supportive. So next slide. The really important thing to remember is that this takes place, as we said right at the beginning, this takes place on the daily basis for students accessing the VLE. And this is where we begin to recognize that there needs to be a spectrum of statements. Having a VLE statement is great, but as you can see in the diagram here, beneath the VLE statement, I've got a fine art course, I've got an engineering course, a media studies course, I've got a business studies course, I've got a medieval literature course. Now they all sit in the same VLE, and so they all have some sort of top level accessibility pros and cons built into my VLE. But at course level, my fine art course is probably packed with images. My engineering course is probably packed with equations and symbols and formulae. My media studies course is probably rich in videos and possibly in audio and podcasts. My business studies course probably got a lot of graphs in it. My medieval literature course is probably full of scanned texts of ancient Anglo-Saxon. Each of those has a completely different suite of accessibility pros and cons for different people. And that needs to be stated at local level. If we look at the next slide, this does not have to be a complete replica of the sample statement. At local level, you're focusing on the things that are important to the student. And to be honest, so many courses that I've looked at working with AbilityNet and with JISC over the last few years, so many courses have a module introduction at the beginning anyway, week 1 module introduction. And there's normally some content there that tells you how the module's been put together, where the assignments will come and who's teaching you and all that lot. There's no reason on earth why every module introduction shouldn't be able to have some pertinent information that is formative for students. So I've given an example there, just a sort of mock-up, where you can see that this could be a single page document. Welcome to the course. We aim to make everyone, sorry, my video is covering up, so I can't read it. We aim to make everyone as productive as possible with online content. For example, you can, and then tell them how the way you structure your Word documents or your PDFs or the way you put notes in the notes field of your presentations actually gives them more opportunities than they would otherwise have. And so that simple statement where all the blue bits are actually covering the content on the left-hand side, and some of the bits on the left hand side about, you know, what's the EHRC mechanism for reporting problems, you don't need to have that on every single course, because you can have a link from every single course. If you want to escalate a complaint, here's the link, and that links to some other content you've got centrally. So, and it also links to your VLE accessibility information. So you can have things that are completely contextualized, that the tutors delivering the course can take ownership for. And for them to write that part means that they have to think about what their practices are. They have to say what they are doing to improve their practices. So next slide, please. On this slide, it's not one that we're going to cover in any detail now, but it's just a handy one you might want to look at afterwards, because some of the hardest bits that people find when doing a statement is to work out from the different criteria that you might be looking for your audit. How do you then fit that into the boxes you should be able to, how accessible this website is, content not within scope, non-compliance, and so on. So I've put together a flow diagram there. And again, there's a description of that in the notes field of the presentation with all the links that are relevant. So that might be helpful in helping you work out, when you do your statement, where the different elements go. That's more for the top level statement than the course, but it kind of gives you a sense as to that cognitive flow that ends up with you saying to students, this will work, this is how to use it, this may not work, this is how to get around it. So next slide. Just to end by saying that there's a number of support services. Other people may talk more about this at the end. Unfortunately, I have to go as soon as I finish this section because I've got another session for somebody else. But AbilityNet FEHE bundle does some technical accessibility testing for some of you. If you're not quite sure in terms of screen reader testing, or you can find the problems but you don't know how to put them right, you can get brilliant level details from those reports. I work with organizations to do a statement mapper service that kind of looks at creating the statement, but then feeds back into what are the processes, what are the cultural things, what's the training needs, and so on. All able to do some great work on supporting clients to write their accessibility statements. There's a badging process that All Able and Textbox Digital are working on at the moment, so that you can say, okay, this is compliant, it's a bronze, this is compliant plus, it's formative, it's actionable, so this is maybe a silver, and then there's a gold where you score really well on not just meeting the compliance, but actually giving a transformative experience to the learners. Accessibility maturity support, we talked about the model. Contact AbilityNet for support on that. Implementing accessibility, JISC's got some training courses on implementing accessibility, the link's there, and then the link also there to the JISC blog. So lots of support services there, in addition to the range of free webinars that are out there, the LexDis content. I forgot to put the link for LexDis in there. Sorry, George might mention that. Lots of support out there, but just believe me, this is potentially one of the most exciting things that could happen, not just for your disabled students, but for your whole digital maturity. So see it that way. And that's it from me. A minute early as well.
Well, thank you, Alistair. And I know you need to head off to run a training session. So if you do have any questions for Alistair, we should be able to answer those in a follow-up blog. So do put them in the Q&A section, and if we can't answer them now, then we'll follow up at a later stage. Thanks, Alistair.
Thank you very much. Bye.
So moving on to George Rhodes, who you might also be a familiar face to many of you in the HE sector. And today he's also joined by Nick Jarvis-Smith from the Department for Education, who's been also helping to do some research into essential services. So over to you both.
Thank you, Ronnie. Right, so many of you may know me, some of you may not. I spend a lot of my time looking at accessibility statements. Hopefully, most of you will have seen my research. If we can go to the next slide, I've got a little bit of a picture on that. As of most recently, I've looked at 1,824 UK accessibility statements and other guidance pages, because some you certainly wouldn't describe anywhere near as a compliant accessibility statement. I know I'm supposed to kind of say, here's some good examples of what you should be doing, but as James has really thoroughly demonstrated, there's all of the GDS guidance out there at the moment, and the only way to really be writing a compliant accessibility statement at the moment is through the GDS template. As good or bad as that template might be, if you know you've got criticisms of it, that's fair enough. But the only way to meet the requirements that GDS have put out there is to match everything that's in that template at the moment, because there's a lot of stuff in there about specific wording or specific heading structures you have to use. So I'm going to take a little bit of a different tack rather than saying how you should do it, because there's only really one way, and going to quickly show you one example which kind of gives a range of common pitfalls all in one. If you're interested in me going on at length about common pitfalls, back in May I spoke at the GDS Global Accessibility Awareness Day events. The recordings of that are up and available, so you can see me talk through a larger number of other really sort of poor examples that I've found over the last go. So the thing I have most complaint about when I'm looking at accessibility statements is probably disproportionate burden. I go on about disproportionate burden a lot, and Alistair mentioned it earlier that he could have probably put money on the fact I was going to talk about disproportionate burden. I see this quite a lot in accessibility statements, because as we all know, writing out this piece of documentation and seeing the questions come in as we've been going through James and Alistair's slides about how many statements should I have, what's the sort of split for what statements should cover, just the reporting aspect of these new regulations, just delivering accessibility statements is a lot of work, let alone auditing, all the other testing and all the other work to actually make services more accessible. Just this reporting is a lot of work. So something that I see quite a lot of people making claims for is disproportionate burden, which is a useful clause in the regulations. It allows organisations to avoid having to meet the full requirements of the regs by the deadline if they can demonstrate a reasonable level of proof that it would be disproportionate for them to meet that. Now, hearing from GDS, I know that the main thing that they're going to consider when looking at disproportionate burden claims is cost, but I think there are other things that should be going into that, including things like equality impact assessments. But the main thing GDS has said is certainly cost at the moment. Now, I'm not going to get into what is a viable disproportionate burden claim and what isn't, because at the end of the day, it's your organisation's position and whether you really cannot meet this requirement. Now, I see this being used a lot more by smaller organisations that may not have the staff, the training, the funding to be able to deliver these things by September. But I've seen a lot of larger organisations claiming as well. And the main things that I see people doing incorrectly are claiming without any evidence. I've seen a number of FOIs that have gone to organisations who have said, no, we don't have any kind of evidence to back up this claim that says we're not going to be legally compliant for this large amount of stuff. For things that are actually exemptions, so the example on the right, which I'll get to in a minute, that says quite a lot about PDFs and other documents, and says that it would be disproportionate burden to fix those. Many PDFs and other documents are exempt under the regulations if we're talking about archived content, stuff that's, you know, historical meeting minutes, things like that from 4 years ago, old policies, things like that. Those aren't going to change, and it is not very sensible to be going back and trying to fix everything when you should be sort of facing forwards. But obviously we still have the requirements under the Equality Act to go back and make changes to those documents if anyone does ask for an accessible copy. And the third one, which gets me most of the time, is just claiming disproportionate burden excessively to get out of any and all commitment. This is one I'm seeing fairly regularly, but this example on the right really brings it home to me. So this is an example I found from an NHS organisation. I'm not going to say which one, but suffice to say it's a very large NHS organisation. And it reads, at present, we do not scan our site for issues, as the cost and effort of maintaining our content would be a disproportionate burden, and as such rely on our page owners and editors to keep their content up to date, many of which are clinicians. Now, personally, considering I found this in May, I think our hardworking NHS clinicians have quite enough on their plate at the moment, without also being told that they're responsible for all of the web content. This is a particularly poor show for me, as they're saying doing anything to maintain our content or make it accessible is too much effort for us. It's disproportionate burden. Really not an appropriate approach, in my opinion. Really seems like they're trying to get out of a lot of the work, and also within larger organizations you need to have someone take ownership of the accessibility work, and a lot of the time that falls within the IT department or some form of policy department. But yeah, this kind of claim for everything and pushing the burden onto other people is really not what I see as an appropriate disproportionate burden claim. And then the issues with PDFs and other documents one, just coming back, it reads, PDFs are not able to comply with the requirements of the web accessibility standards. Our site contains a large number of PDFs, especially those in our documents and policies section and board papers. We do not intend to recreate them in accessible versions, as this would be a disproportionate burden. And as I've said, that could actually be made an exemption. There's a lot of things to go wrong with accessibility statements, particularly with how specific the requirements are. If we can go to the next slide, please. So I just wanted to reiterate some of what James has said. Follow the GDS guidance. GDS has a sample accessibility statement for websites which covers the legal requirements and gives instructions on completing the template. You may still need some expertise to be able to do it. It's certainly worth doing a bit more reading yourselves around the regulations, which is only about 9 pages, and some of the guidance. Certainly looking at other help available through AbilityNet or the JISC forums to help you get your understanding, rather than just going off and following the GDS template. As Alistair said, that really only sort of comes up to point 3 in the maturity model if you do it correctly and substitute a lot of the content for your own content. But there's certainly a lot more that can be done, more than just what's said to meet the bare minimum legal compliance. 2 other points I wanted to touch on, if you're going to go away and do your own reading. 2 things I've been seeing that add to confusion lately. If you are looking for the PSBAR regulations documents on legislation.gov, the number you're looking for is number 952, because there are 2 versions of PSBAR. There's the original 852, which got repealed, and then after about 47 days of it being live, got repealed and immediately replaced with PSBAR regs number 2. And the number you're looking for on legislation.gov.uk is number 952. There are differences in the 2 versions, so you need to be quoting the correct one. And the other thing which people may not be aware of, which gives some really crucial insight to why specific wording is required by GDS's sample statement, which you don't necessarily get out of just the PSBAR regulation document, is the model accessibility statement. That's also up on legislation.gov.uk. It's a direct transposition of the European model statement. I really suggest people go and read that to look at, in particular, a lot of the notes around how it says you should provide information for your known issues and non-compliance areas. So to get back into something a little bit more interesting than me just pointing you at legislation.gov links, I'm going to talk about quickly some of the findings out of my latest research. I've got a bar chart on the next slide, which shows some of the growth. So in particular, I know we're aiming at a HEFE audience today. Universities have seen some really good growth. Considering they are one of the largest groups compared to police, there's only about 47 websites that I've looked at. They're very compliant because they've all been moving over to one single standardized template. Universities, considering the range, the fact that we're up to more than 30% compliance now is really, really fantastic. Really taking it on board. Local government, just starting to hit 20%. Again, considering there's 380 odd local government websites that I've looked at a district and county level, the move towards compliance is getting there, and I really hope to see this all jump up when I redo this research in September, so we will know who has met the regulation deadline and who has not. Fire and rescue, a doubling of compliance up to about 10%. They're starting to really pick up pace now, and there's only a few fire services across the country, so that's great. Colleges is an area that I'm really worried about. So further FE institutes, I'm really kind of worried about, because I've looked at 384 of their websites and we've got 11 compliance statements. I think part of this is due to the lack of sort of guidance and specific engagement that FE colleges have received up till now. So it's an area that I've personally been trying to reach out to people and provide more support and provide more guidance, but definitely an area that I think collectively we need to start engaging people from colleges more to raise awareness if people aren't already aware. NHS, quite poor at the moment, with only, I think, 26 compliance statements, just under 6% compliance. Really difficult. I know they're in a really difficult situation at the moment, but there's a lot to be said for our NHS services being essential. Should be accessible. I've then also sort of branched off and been looking at a few other types of organisation, disability assessment centres, industry regulators, and a few others which I kind of consider essential. So disability assessment centres and industry regulators are looking at around the same sort of percentage compliance, at around sort of 7%. We're gonna look in a minute, and Nick's going to tell us a little bit more about some of the essential services we've been specifically looking at in a bit more depth. But I've looked at supermarket accessibility statements. I've looked at utilities providers, all of these organisations which, as we now know, are listed by the government as absolutely essential services in this time of pandemic, or in the case of utility regulators, train companies. All of these are geographical monopolies. If I go to my local train station, I've only got a choice of South Eastern Rail. I have no other option. If South Eastern Rail services are not accessible, I'm kind of stuck for train transport. Same with my water company, South East Water. They're the only one I've got a choice of. So I think accessibility should be required of them as essential services. So that's kind of enough from me. I'm going to pass over to Nick, who's going to go into a little bit more detail about what we've been looking at in terms of essential services.
Cheers, George. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So as George was saying, we were talking about essential services. We got together, we decided to do some work on that. And by essential services, we mean under Section 4, where the web accessibility regulations, which James mentioned earlier, talks about NGOs being exempt unless they provide, NGOs being non-government organisations are exempt unless they provide an essential service. And as you can see, we've got some definitions on there about the UN definition, the hospital sector, etc., etc. And then you've got the UK government COVID-19 guidance, which included things like supermarkets, where we kind of focused our attention because of the inherent difficulties with navigating a one-way system and keeping a 2-metre social distance for certain individuals who have accessibility needs, and we're wondering whether they would have the option to shop online instead of going in store. So we submitted an FOI response to the Cabinet. So submitted an FOI, Freedom of Information request, to the Cabinet Office. And if we move to the next slide, thank you. It covers kind of the scope of essential services. So essentially what the Cabinet Office have said in this response is that the organisation has to be considered a public sector body and the service has to be essential to the public to cover under essential services. And it actually says there explicitly it won't include things like supermarkets or banks, even though under the COVID guidance they were considered essential to the public. So if we move on to the next slide, I'll just cover briefly kind of what our research on supermarkets entailed. Basically, we completed some testing on the 4 main supermarkets that offer delivery. Some of the other ones didn't offer any delivery, so we obviously couldn't test them. And the testing that we completed included things like automated testing, manual testing, using kind of user flows and scripts, using a screen reader. And then we completed some analysis of the accessibility statements, which we're going to talk about today, considering the scope of this webinar is to cover is the accessibility statement ready yet. So if we move on to the next slide, sorry, yeah, thank you. So the findings that we've got, yeah, you can see on the screen, the analysis that we did led to kind of realize that none of the supermarkets in their statements suggested that they were compliant with the WCAG guidelines. As you can see, kind of one of the supermarkets provided nothing, and we've kind of anonymized this just so that just to keep things easier. So another supermarket provided a short message about the commitment under the Quality Act, but didn't really mention anything about the web accessibility regulations. Another supermarket offered some more technical information about the structure and also links for support for shoppers with disabilities. And there was one supermarket which provided probably the best statement, which included support, tips, the standards that they're working towards, and also like a clear route for people who experience accessibility issues. So that was kind of the best of them all, but none of them suggested that they were completely compliant with the guidelines. So that was a little bit of a worry for us. And we've also completed some other testing and research, and if you want to ask questions about that, we can answer questions on that. And if we want to move to slide 5, we're just going to move to some closing thoughts. We hope that our research has kind of opened up this discussion, which we hope will be productive and help to enhance accessibility of essential services. So things like banks, supermarkets, utilities, like George was saying, especially ones that have monopolies. And to read more on our research, just head to the AbilityNet blog, which I think Annie posted today. So it's well worth a read if you're interested in that area. I'll pass back to Annie for a Q&A. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. I can see lots of Q&As coming through. So just to say thank you to George, Nick, James and Alistair. So if you've got any further questions, please fire away in the Q&A window. I'll just pick out a few questions, some of which are more suitable for Alistair to cover. So as I mentioned earlier, we'll cover those in a follow-up blog. But here's one, maybe George, you may be able to answer this, or James. This is from Peter. Do we need to produce statements for all systems? And specifically, is a statement required for a system that's only used internally by members of staff? So
yes, it kind of depends. So if it's a web-based system and it's internal use only, it counts as an intranet under the regulations. So what you're looking for there is anything created new since the regulations have come in, or when older systems are substantially revised. But yes, even your internal internal services accessed through your web browser will be covered by the regulations.
Okay, and we've got another question from Victoria. I'm confused about third-party suppliers, for example, our library catalogue. Do we need to add an accessibility statement to our catalogue? And would we include information about all the ebook, e-journal providers for accessibility from there?
Oh, if only Alistair was here, because this is absolutely Alistair's bag. There's an awful lot of information about ebook and e-journal providers through the ASPIRE framework already. Alistair did sort of briefly touch on it during his slides, but the ASPIRE framework has loads of information in there about ebook publishers and the accessibility of them. That would be a great place to start if you want to start providing information about the ebook publishers you use. But yes, there are kind of requirements within the regulations for content that you pay for. So even if it's third party, if you're paying for it and choosing to deliver that to your staff or students, that you will hold some responsibility for that. James, I don't know if you've got any more thoughts.
Yes, and I think there's also the I think the ASPIRE framework would obviously be a good place to look, and the I know in general with third-party accessibility statements, I think there's the text box crowdsourced resource that's being built up on third-party accessibility statements for systems in general that may be useful.
Yeah, so that one's called Searchbox. It is delivered by Textbox, but the crowdsourced third-party accessibility statements list is their Searchbox service.
Okay, and next question is from Caroline. Any advice on collating third-party suppliers' accessibility statements? Is it best to provide them per supplier or by category under compliant, partially, and non-compliant? I thought possibly this one might be one for you, George.
Yeah, I'm just having a think about it. I don't really know. I haven't really thought about which way. So a lot of the third-party stuff I see is normally internal products. So you might be looking to host them on your main intranet, or if you've got like a main sort of IT system that can also host knowledge articles, etc., something like that. I don't really know. I haven't really thought about whether you want to do it by supplier or whether you want to do it by whether they failed or not. Depending on how you record them, you might be able to filter one way or the other.
Okay, and James, do you have any thoughts on that as well?
Yeah, I guess as George says, I think it'd probably be worth being able to filter them either way, depending upon what information you want to get out of them. Just having a way that's easy for people to get to. I think the critical thing is making sure that they're linked from a user point of view. It's having things linked to from the resources that they're actually using. So thinking about how users are going to use them, and potentially having something that you can you might have something you might want to reference them internally across all of your websites if you've got a large web domain, but also thinking about how they're presented to users as well.
Okay, and this one's an interesting question. Is there any research on having a compliance statement, how well having a compliance statement corresponds to actual accessibility? James, James and George and Nick as well.
I mean, I did a little bit on this back in earlier versions of my research. So if you look back in the spreadsheets, which you can download from the research page, which has just all of my findings in it going back, one of the things I used to record was the WebA Millions score. So people might be familiar with the WebAIM Millions work, in which they gave rankings to the top sort of million websites and how accessible their homepages were. I know it's not indicative of the entire site, but the homepage was kind of a good start. From the couple of times I did it, I really found no correlation between a compliance statement and the level of accessibility for a website. Someone could have a really awful website, but could have sat down and written a technically compliant statement that lists all of their known issues. Yeah, from my experience, they're not necessarily related.
And equally, you can also get services that are compliant and usable, and then don't have a compliance statement. One thing with the compliance statement is you might actually see, because you've got a clear route for escalating accessibility issues or feeding back, you might actually see an increase in complaints around accessibility, even though you've produced a compliance statement. So that's one thing to kind of consider, that you might actually see more feedback from users, which is actually a good thing, but some people could perceive that as we're getting more complaints just because we've got an accessible statement, which a compliance statement, which is something you should really factor in.
Yeah. Okay. Probably the last question, might have a chance for another one after this. This is from Kevin. Do you think that GDS, I know that you've had some involvement with them, might consider, that's the government digital service, might consider mandating a post, that a post must exist in an organisation to be responsible for accessibility?
I'm gonna say I don't think GDS would ever mandate that personally, and I think it would be really hard to kind of enforce if you've got to tell, as we were talking about before this call, you know, if you're telling a parish council who's only got one member of staff, their parish clerk, that suddenly they've got to find the budget to hire an accessibility professional. It's the same way as with GDPR, when everyone had to get a data protection officer. Many of the organisations of smaller organisations have sort of farmed out that responsibility to advisors and things like that.
Okay.
It would be lovely, obviously, if that was possible. But yeah, I think in practical terms, and in terms of GDS's actual powers, I don't think that's going to happen.
We can but hope one day.
I like George's example of using GDPR. It's quite a similar regulation that came from the EU into UK law. And if you look at, I worked at the NHS, and one of the things that they did was they had GDPR champions and things, and that's the same type of approach we should take to accessibility. Try and get people to own that themselves, rather than having one person where this is all pinned on.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much to all of you. And like I mentioned earlier, we'll be having a follow-up blog to cover some of the unanswered questions that you've sent through. So finally, just a little bit more information that might be of interest to you. We also run online training sessions on accessibility. You can find out at abilitynet.org.uk/training. There's a 10% off discount code available to registrants for this particular webinar, which is HE Statement 10. And then we have a suite of accessibility services aimed at public, higher and further education sectors, including Alistair's accessibility statement mapper option that you can see more about on our website. And then you can also sign up to our newsletter for the latest announcements about digital accessibility. And we've got webinars coming up on the 11th and 18th of August, and the next HE focused and public sector update is on the 22nd of September, the day before the regulations deadline. So thank you again, everyone, and James, Alistair, George and Nick, and we'll be in touch with you soon. Bye, everybody.